Chapter 2 Aerobic Politics. In the meantime, there was work to do. The usual speaking and writing and lobbying, the mothering. The usual, that is, until at their 1980 convention, the Republican Party officially cast the ERA out of its platform and prompted me to take the first overt step out of the mainstream politics of national women's organizations. 12 of us, dressed in white, with heavy chains draped around our waists, leapt out of the back of a pickup truck one morning, raced across the lawn, and chained ourselves across the main entrance to the Republican National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. It was August 26, 1980, Women's Equality Day, a fitting day to demonstrate our outrage at the blatant anti-woman, anti-human rights stance of the party that came to power crying for the abolition of slavery. The irony was not lost on us, neither did we misread what lay ahead if a Republican were elected to the White House. When we rushed the door, two large men began pushing against it from inside, flailing at us and kicking one woman sharply, trying to keep us from bolting the door shut. The pain and confusion at the door caused our first line to fall back in disarray for a split second, long enough for the men to smell victory and to let down their guard a little. Just as they did, two women sprang forward again. With incredible presence of mind, they surveyed the scene, saw the lock they had planned to use hanging useless where in the melee they had accidentally locked it to only one side of the double door, got my lock from me, and manipulated it and the heavy chain successfully, all in the time it took the men inside to do a double-take. As smoothly and calmly as if we'd been doing it together all our lives, the 12 of us chained ourselves to one another, those on the ends chained ourselves to the railings, and in about 2 minutes from the time we jumped from the back of the truck, we had locked the Republicans uptight in their headquarters. Out on the front porch, we sang at the top of our lungs, "Like Susan B. Anthony, we shall not be moved. Just like the suffragists who went before us, we shall not be moved." The police duly arrived, but when they discovered that their cutters weren't big enough to cut our chains, they decided to wait us out instead of arresting us. So we stood on the porch in the blazing sun all day long, singing, chanting, reading our statement, and burning the Republican platform, while the cops lounged and chatted together in the shade of the trees, and 100 protesters carrying placards, banners, and signs marched back and forth on the sidewalk. Others joined us, and after we had together blocked all the doors to the building, we were told that people were climbing in and out of the building through the back windows. So we sang for them, "Go in and out the windows, go in and out the windows, go in and out the windows, we want the ERA." It was a well-planned, well-executed action, and it took courage. I was proud of it then, and I'm proud of it still. So far as I know, we were the first group to organize and carry out a civilly disobedient action on behalf of the ERA. At the time, it seemed like a giant step, no doubt because the commonly held opinion among heads of women's organizations was that women could make the most headway by appearing politically cool and savvy, by exciting the admiration of men for how well we could play their game, by being sophisticated, dignified, politically mature, blah, blah, blah. Civil disobedience on behalf of women was regarded as undignified and immature. It would turn people off. It would hurt the movement. But mostly, it wasn't respectable, and more than anything else, the leaders of the women's organizations craved respect from the men in power, wanted to appear objective and rational, longed to be seated among them, making public policy. They knew that people who respond with appropriate passion do not end up, for the most part, in Congress. In the years since I became associated with the National Organization for Women, its national leaders have never, to my knowledge, participated in an arrestable action on behalf of women. Even when the ERA was seriously endangered, they frowned upon civil disobedience. So when I read in the Washington Post on February 1985 that the president of Now had been arrested in front of the South African embassy for protesting apartheid, I felt as if I'd been kicked in the stomach. I deplore apartheid, and I'm glad that it's now become politically and socially acceptable, even sophisticated, to protest racism, even if it's only racism abroad. Senators, congresspersons, movie stars, the cream of society is doing it. Protesters gain in stature and risk nothing. Racism as an issue has prestige because it involves the freedom of men. Almost everyone understands the necessity, at least in theory, at least rhetorically, for men to be free. But women? Let's not be ridiculous. I'm willing to bet that if apartheid applied only to black women in South Africa, no one important, and I mean no one, would be paying the slightest public attention to it, to say nothing of being arrested over it, least of all the National Organization for Women. Women's freedom as an issue has no prestige. Leaders of Now do not even use the word sexism anymore. They list the ERA, reproductive rights, racism, and discrimination based on sexual preference as their issues. I once found reprehensible their lack of courage in saying the word patriarchy, but now they have lost the nerve even to say sexism. Perhaps I should refer to them as the National Organization of Women, not for women. If apartheid applied only to women, even some feminists might argue that apartheid is a purely cultural matter, like the wearing of the chador in the Middle East, or genital mutilation in Africa, or compulsory motherhood in Nicaragua. It strikes me as odd that physical and psychological restraint and damage done to men, violations of men's human rights, are never viewed as cultural phenomena in this way. Because the repressive atmosphere in the organized women's movement surrounding civil disobedience encouraged us to care more about turning people off than about fulfilling the many powerful purposes of civil disobedience, we tried to involve as many overtly religious women as possible in the Republican headquarters action. This, we thought, would lend us an aura of seriousness and dignity. Everyone would understand that women still respectful of patriarchal religion are not dangerous at all, not kooks, not free and independent and wild, not scary as hell. So our caution demanded that we look as respectable in society's terms as possible under our chains and locks. I detested society's terms, but because I loved the ERA, I hid my wobbly integrity from myself and appeared as one of the handmaidens of the Lord. My decision to move into civil disobedience sprang out of impatience with the cautious, toadying model of behavior being held up for women by the women's organizations. I remembered Alice Paul, 1885 to 1977, and her similar frustration with the suffrage movement on her return from England and her work with the rambunctious and successful Pankhursts. I love the quotation from Susan B. Anthony. Cautious, careful people, always casting about to preserve their reputation or social standards, never can bring about reform. Those who are really in earnest are willing to be anything or nothing in the world's estimation, and publicly and privately, in season and out, avow their sympathies with despised ideas and their advocates, and bear the consequences. In a letter to my mother describing our action, I wrote, somewhat acrimoniously, perhaps Now and the caucus and the League held press conferences about the Republican debacle. If so, it was a feeble and appropriate response. Press conferences don't demonstrate sufficient seriousness. More important, they don't demand courage of the few participants, and don't inspire courage in their spectators. Press conferences, lawful marches, protests, demonstrations, none teaches women to step over the line and discover in ourselves undreamed reservoirs of love and daring. Civil disobedience does. In November 1980, 21 of us were arrested up in Bellevue, Washington, for chaining ourselves to the gate of the new Mormon temple that was scheduled to open that day. Throughout the preceding weekend, 2 young women had remained chained to the gate, protesting the Mormons' nationwide political campaign against the ERA. On Sunday evening, when several of us Mormons for ERA spoke at a Now convention in Seattle, I praised the women who had persevered in that action despite Now's strong disapproval, and said something such as, "Tomorrow the temple will open and I'll be there. Anybody who wants to help me chain the gate shut to demonstrate that Mormons are keeping the gates of justice bolted against all women, meet with me after this meeting and we'll get ourselves organized." The next morning dawned cold, and the damp wound itself around a body's bones. I bundled up until I could scarcely move. At around 8:30, we advanced upon the gate, arm in arm, singing. The Mormon security guards began to attack us at once, throwing at least one woman to the ground, kicking and generally manhandling others. Despite them, we managed somehow to chain up. The Bellevue police arrested us for failure to quit, carried us to their cars, zipped us to the station, and stowed us in holding tanks. The Bellevue chief of police, whose wife was an ardent ERA supporter, later sent us roses, and later still, Christmas cards. We called ourselves the Bellevue 21 and felt pleased with our action and ourselves. We thought we were the first group in the country to succeed in being arrested for the ERA. We hoped we were pioneers, and that women everywhere would begin to make discrimination increasingly more difficult, time-consuming, and unpleasant for the men in power. I began to feel downright evangelical about civil disobedience after this. I was desperate to move out of the static posture of supplication and appeasement interspersed with temper tantrums that characterized the behavior of the organized women's movement, desperate to move into an independent, fearless space of women's own definition. In February, I wrote an article for Common Cause that I entitled In Defense of Immoderation, which they timidly changed to In Defense of Equal Rights. We are afraid of appropriate feeling and appropriate action because the only appropriate feeling for women in the United States today is fury, and the only appropriate action is immoderate. If women don't soon begin to think we're worthy of the many and immense personal sacrifices it's going to take to get our civil rights, if we don't value ourselves and other women enough to make these sacrifices and expect and ask and accept them from others, we are quite simply not going to get justice. We must learn from the men that to gain anything, we must be willing to risk everything. Men have always understood that they had to fight and die for their human rights. They have always understood that justice is never bestowed, that it is always wrested by the most incredible courage and daring out of the hands of fate. Women must demand, now, and if necessary at the peril of our lives, that we be granted our civil rights in the same way rich white men in this country were granted theirs, by constitutional decree. Women's time has come, but it can pass us by if we sink into despair, into another season of silence. It can pass us by if we are afraid of doing what all other fighters for human rights have had to do to win them. I certainly didn't want to die. I loved life and was having the time of mine. I didn't want other women to die either. But I sensed that we had to stop worrying about the possibility of dying, death meaning also social death, political death, if we wanted to move on to another place. We had to stop being afraid of losing credibility, respect, social standing, elections, our lives. We had simply to stop being afraid. Though I was frantic to escape the deadening conventional political modes, I was still struggling in the masculist mire of atonement. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Jesus' life for your sins. I wrote in my journal, "I always think of this as balancing the scales. When you want something weighty and significant, such as justice, you put it on one side of the scales and see what it's going to take to make it balance. On the other side of the scales, you can put all the lobbying, letter writing, fundraising, caring, all the demonstrations, all that, and it still won't balance. It's just not enough. Justice is too expensive. We don't get something for nothing. We pay an exact price. If we want something precious, we pay with something precious. That's how I understand it." By spring of 1981, Mary Ann Beale, whom I had met in Copenhagen and had immediately seen eye to eye with on civil disobedience, was back in Virginia, and together we organized a group to do civil disobedience around women's issues in the Washington, D.C. area. In coordination with several women in New York City, we called ourselves the Congressional Union, taking the name and philosophy from the women's suffrage group created in 1914 by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns that later became the National Woman's Party and gave us the Equal Rights Amendment. In the winter of 1981, beginning with the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, the Congressional Union held a vigil in front of the White House every Wednesday from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. But the first major action was planned for July 4, 1981. Looking back, I can hardly believe that civil disobedience aroused such fervor in my soul. I can hardly believe it, that is, until I remember how few options seemed open to us, how up against the walls of possibility we had been driven, and how fervently I sought for an opening. I knew there was one, somewhere. Though I never believed that civil disobedience itself would somehow miraculously change the system, I did believe, but believe no longer, that before we can move into the psychological and philosophical place where we can see the next step, we must do all we can see to do in the present, inadequate as it may appear and be. And there seemed to be much to be said for civil disobedience. Through it, I received an invaluable education, one that propelled me still farther up the spiral of my odyssey and further out of my disabling habits of mind. During the July 4th Congressional Union celebration, for instance, I collected some important data on the problem of fear, which I still had simmering in the back of my mind. I had already seen how civil disobedience made women feel powerful, good about themselves, even exultant, but somehow this wasn't registering as an idea. The events of July 4th brought the loose, disconnected threads of information together. In one small flash of illumination, a coherent theory appeared. The rain began the night of the 3rd. We couldn't believe it. How could nature betray us like this? We had ordered a grand piano for Margie Adam to be set up in Lafayette Park and a complicated sound system for her and the speakers. We were calling the action Relighting Feminist Fires, a tacit acknowledgement that they had gone out, and planned to burn misogynist sayings of famous men. We had expected thousands of women. When the rain didn't stop by noon, we gathered together in front of the White House, the 300 or so soggy bodies which had braved the weather, and tried to hear the speeches. After a while, looking over the bedraggled, woebegone assemblage, I couldn't bear it a moment longer. Taking the megaphone, I stood up on the ledge by the fence and shouted, "I'm going out into Pennsylvania Avenue, and I'm going to kneel there and pray for passage of the ERA, and for women. I want the ERA ratified. I want women in the Constitution. Anybody who'd like to join me in the street is very welcome." Handing the megaphone to someone, I stepped down off the ledge and started through the crowd. "Will you come with me?" I asked the women on either side of me as they fell back to make an aisle. They all shook their heads and looked down. "Well, you've done it now," I chided myself. "You're going to feel mighty foolish out there by yourself in the middle of the street." But I kept walking. What else could I do? And just as I reached the curb, someone grabbed my hand. Thank goodness, I thought with relief. At least there'll be two of us. But when I got into the street and turned to kneel down, I saw that a long line of women had clasped hands and followed us into the street. 60 women knelt in Pennsylvania Avenue, stopping traffic for over an hour that day. It seemed to us that every police person in the district rushed to the scene in police cars, on motorcycles, on horses. 2 vans of barking dogs arrived, part of the intimidation program, and a couple of officers handed out billy clubs to all the rest. Finally, the police lined up in formation in front of us, feet apart, arms in front with the billy clubs conspicuously at center, faces set and staring straight ahead. During all this exercise in bullying, even more women joined us, until we had 2 rows of bodies across the street, all kneeling and holding hands. By this time the sun was shining. Crowds gathered on both sides of the street and joined us in singing and chanting. The officer in charge gave us the standard warning, "If you don't leave the street in 5 minutes, you will be arrested." In 10 minutes he warned us again. 15 minutes later he barked at us, "This is absolutely your last warning. If you're not out of the street in 5 minutes, we'll have to arrest you." 10 minutes later he shouted, "Now ladies, this is positively, absolutely your last warning." Obviously they did not want to arrest us. While we were receiving multiple last warnings, those of us who had planned the festival were putting our heads together. As far as we knew, none of the women kneeling in the street had received nonviolence training or knew what to expect if they were arrested. This was a worrisome situation. So we decided to wait as long as we dared, and then, just as the arrests were really about to begin, direct everyone up and out of the street, which, much to the relief of the police, is what we did. Safely back on the sidewalk, many of the women who had been in the street wanted some kind of closure on the experience. They didn't want just to wander off home without any acknowledgement or discussion of what we'd just done. so we formed a circle and began to take turns telling how we had been affected by what had happened. Every woman was euphoric, high with admiration for herself. I remember one woman particularly. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded, as she stepped into the circle. "I'm just a housewife from Maryland, but I knelt in that street for over an hour. I could have been arrested. I would have been arrested. And I did it for women. I didn't know I had the courage to do anything like that." She paused, then turned to me and asked, "When are we going to do it again?" Many women expressed similar excitement at discovering how much they cared about themselves and other women, how deep their longings for justice and dignity went. They all felt bigger and nobler, capable of so much more than they had thought. Each had caught a glimpse of her true stature and was ready to grow into it as fast as possible. It was all very heady stuff. I had been through this psychic upheaval while doing religious disobedience in the Mormon Church. I knew I was observing a significant phenomenon. Standing there, I tried to put it together. I knew that women had been deeply socialized to obey the law. Obeying the law is a large part of obeying men generally, and the male God has ordained that obeying men is the fundamental law governing women's lives. Matters of life and death hinge upon obedience to it. So, when we prepare to break the law, our spirits bark their shins sharply against the killer taboo. Unconsciously, we make the lethal connection and are overwhelmed with fear for our lives. But when we stand fast despite our fear and do indeed break the law, leave our battering husbands or our battering churches, or stop cleaning up after our husbands and kids, or love another woman, preparing on some deep level to die, the miracle happens. We live. Though the taboo tells us we can't disobey the men and live, we are nevertheless alive. In fact, we've never been so alive. How can we account for feeling more alive by the second? Has it all been a lie, then? Just a plot to keep us terrified and trapped in our subordinate caste? No, it's not a lie, it's a paradox. The truth is that to displease men, to disobey them, is still deadly for women, but the truth also is that only when we stop obeying men do we truly begin to live. Daring to ignore the first half of the paradox and to live out fully the second half opens our eyes to the meaning and implications of the unwritten laws we obey. For instance, though the taboo tells us that we can only live if we obey men, our experience tells us that it is a lie. We see that we live more genuinely and richly when we stop obeying men and start obeying ourselves. But more than this, we realize that men kill us no matter what we do, whether we obey or disobey. It is true that violence against women increases as we as a group show signs of rebellion, as the mere threat of violence ceases to keep us in line. Nonetheless, our blood has been fresh on men's hands for millennia. Civil disobedience can teach women the truth. We do not need to be afraid that in the breach we will not have sufficient courage to do whatever it is we must do. Civil disobedience can teach us that the inadequacies we fear are mostly imaginary. As women, we have borne our oppression because we have been afraid that the alternative was to die. But when we learn that we die in the same numbers anyway, and that a life lived in fear is also a death, that a life without fear is the only life worthy to be called life, then we prepare for freedom. When we understand that the penalties are the same whether we disobey a little or disobey completely, but that the rewards come only when we disobey completely, then we are ready to be free. Insight from correspondence with my friend Linda Barafaldi, November 1985. And when we are finally ready to be free, the avenues to liberty will open before us, and for the first time in 50 centuries we will see the road signs clearly. My mind shifted gears as I watched and understood what I was watching. Any capacity that civil disobedience has to change the system, I thought, must come from its ability to profoundly change women's concepts of ourselves and to alter our ways of being in the world. It not only tells others that we know our own worth, but by providing a stage upon which we can act out our larger selves, it testifies to us too that we are worthy. In telling ourselves that we are serious, we realize, often to our own surprise, how very deeply serious we are. And after this, we find it easier to take ourselves and one another seriously, an incredible feat for any woman. More worthy and more serious, more everything good and strong than we dream we can be, we see how much we have to gain and how little we have to lose, and we slough off our fearful skins. From that Independence Day on, to guide as many women as possible into and through that process of extinguishing fear and illuminating potential was my principal motive for participating in civil disobedience. Between July 4th, 1981, and our leaving to fast for the ERA in Illinois in May 1982, we did at least 13 more actions. These included burning Ronald Reagan and Idaho federal judge Marion Callister, the Mormon federal court judge who ruled the ERA extension unconstitutional, in effigy, holding hands, as was only fitting since they are both as homophobic as they are misogynist, to celebrate Alice Paul's birthday, and going over the White House fence to take a message to our otherwise totally inaccessible president on February 15th, the birthday of Susan B. Anthony. After we had returned from the fast, our group held a ritual mourning on the steps of the archives the night we put the ERA down for a long nap, June 30th, 1982, and the next day, July 1st, a dozen of us were arrested for pouring blood on the pillars and steps of that building in protest against our exclusion from our country's most sacred document, the Constitution, which is housed there. I was still too weak from the fast to do civil disobedience that day, but I wasn't too weak to give a speech. I'm never too weak to give a speech. In it, I quoted Susan B. Anthony. Overthrow this government. Commit its blood-stained constitution to the flames. Blot out every vestige of that guilty bargain of the fathers. Break every fetter, and let the oppressed go free. Several weeks later, when I announced my candidacy for the presidency of NOW, a woman in the National NOW office sent out a letter to all members in her home state of Michigan. The gist of the letter was that I had shouted, "Overthrow this government," on the steps of the archives and had urged women to burn the Constitution, which she revered, as all good United States citizens should. Such shocking intemperance clearly made me unfit to be president of the National Organization for Women. Michigan Now offered to pay postage for a rebuttal, and I had a wonderful time composing it, especially the closing line. After I had given proper credit to Susan for her perspicacious remarks about the Constitution, I pointed out that apparently Susan B. Anthony was too radical to be elected president of NOW. Of course, we are much more conservative and timid than the women who went before us. They would probably affright and offend us at every turn. Some of the women who do research into the lives of our foremothers gloss quickly over evidence that perhaps these women were not politically mature, i.e., polite and deferential. While I was writing this book and trying to find the exact source of the "overthrow this government" quote, I was directed to a woman who was supposed to be an expert on Anthony. She told me she had never read the lines I quoted to her, and moreover, she was sure Anthony had never said them. "It doesn't sound like her at all," she huffed. "Actually, it sounds very much like her indeed. That we have lost sight of Anthony's radicalism in less than a century, or more accurately, lost sight of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's, since it was probably she who wrote Anthony's speech, is astonishing and ominous." At the end of my year of civil disobedience, I could still see the functions it and other mass protests served. But to me, only one of these justified its use at all in the women's movement, and that was as a way for women to get a taste of their own tangy courage, that sharp and addictive surprise. I knew that such experiences could teach us that we have immense sources of untapped strength and bravery and daring. At their best, they could put us psychically in places where we could hear far-off echoes of bygone greatness and have visions of greatness in the afternoon of this very day. They could help us believe we are capable of anything, and that's the truth as well as the necessity. Best of all, they could help us begin not to be so afraid, of our own burgeoning powers, of not being polite and nice, and of the censure that will inevitably bring upon us, of not following the eminently reasonable leaders of organizations, of physical harm, of hurting the feelings of the men in our lives and of the God-men everywhere, of speaking the truth more boldly. As we become less afraid, we become more dangerous. Patriarchy can exist only so long as women are afraid. Despite all this, I was troubled by it, troubled enough that by the time I left for Illinois and the fast, I was shedding my zeal for it like yet another skin. To be supportive of friends, I have participated in it several times since, but never again with either zeal or conviction. For one thing, by the end of the ERA decade, I understood more clearly our place on this country's protest timeline. The second wave of feminism in the United States, which had been breaking across and disrupting the old social order for more than a decade before I was struck by it, had arisen at a time in the nation's history when all protest, including civil disobedience, had become passé. Or perhaps its inherent futility had only become more evident. By the time women came on the scene the second time, at least 4 waves of civilly disobedient protest had preceded us in this century: militant suffragism, unionism, the Black Civil Rights Movement, and the anti-war movement. From nearly a century of experience in dealing with this brand of protest, the system had either learned to accommodate it without batting an eye, had ceased to fear it, had in fact learned to pirate its energy, or had only learned to do it better. Protests of all sorts had become so yawningly common that in order to be noticed, larger and ever larger numbers of protesters were needed. Then even numbers lost significance. When 500,000 people gather in New York City to protest nuclear weapons, as they did in June 1982, and the powers that be pay as little attention as they did then, we must face and accept that these methods have come to the end of their usefulness, even as a way of attracting notice, to say nothing of changing things, if indeed they ever fundamentally changed anything. When I thought civil disobedience was the best way to proceed, I shut my mind to other possibilities, and when I was using my time and vitality to plan and do civilly disobedient actions, I hadn't much left for doing anything else, even if I had been thinking of alternatives. I understood, gradually, that action of this kind, like electoral politics, deceives us into thinking that we are getting somewhere, achieving something. At least, we think, we are doing all that can be done. There's a grim and deadening complacency in that. In addition, the very nature of civil disobedience forces us to deal with issues superficially. It can't address the complexities of oppression, certainly not the most subtle and insidious, and therefore most intractable of its aspects. These are difficult enough for feminists, people who are for women, to keep in mind, and often we don't, which explains the many women's rights feminists in the movement and the few radical feminists. But my strongest objection was to living constantly in reaction. I had begun to feel like a prodded amoeba, an unpleasant sensation that caused me to rethink the whole process. What I learned was that when we identify ourselves in opposition to something, we become its unwitting accomplices. By bestowing the energy of our belief upon it, by acquiescing to it, we reinforce it as reality. The very difficult truth is that what we resist persists. Since civil disobedience is based on the same old violent value system, being the downside of the war model, attack, resist, we reinforce the very worldview that is destroying women and the planet when we participate in it. I was troubled about keeping the patriarch's sadomasochistic power game going, when that was the very game, those the very rules and assumptions I longed to sweep off the board. I had a very strong hunch as well, and I was rapidly learning to trust my hunches, that in protests we give away our own power, paradoxically give it up to the very group we are trying to take power from. Which means that in the very act of trying to wrest power from the patriarchy, we strengthen it instead. Though I hadn't understood the dynamics of this power giveaway throughout our year-long civil disobedience campaign for the ERA, I had increasingly felt their operation. Several years later, in my study of Ki Aikido, a method of coordinating mind and body, I caught at least a glimpse of the mechanisms of the transfer of power, a glimpse that finally turned into a steady, wide-angled view just recently. According to the theory of Aikido, and my own and others' experience of it, if a person grabs me, let's say, by the wrist, and I focus my attention upon his hold and how I'm going to get out of it, I direct my energy, my ki or life force, into his grip and augment his strength with my own. Now we are both holding me. I'm collaborating in his attack upon me, colluding in my own defeat. But if, instead of focusing on his hand and my wrist, I direct my ki, my intent and energy, toward my own goal, if I think of where I want to go instead of how I'm going to get away, I have a far better chance of breaking free. If my physical strength is anywhere near that of my attacker, I can surely break out of his grip. If I'm physically much weaker, which would more likely be the case, I still have a much better chance if I concentrate on my own goal. And when I don't struggle in the way he expects, he thinks he has won. Momentarily, automatically, and almost imperceptibly, he loosens his grip. In that moment, I extend my ki toward my own goal and escape. That this really works was made abundantly and amazingly clear even in the first session of the Aikido class. My partner grabbed my wrist. Using strength, I wasn't able to get away and couldn't have done so without a real tussle. But when she grabbed my wrist and instead of concentrating upon her grip, I thought instead of how I had to scratch my head, my hand flew out of her grasp to my head almost without effort on my part, though she was expending the same amount of strength to hold me as she had the first time. My partner's next exercise was to bend my arm by placing one hand on my upper arm, the other on my forearm, and forcing them together so that my elbow bent. At first I resisted with strength and she bent my arm easily. But when I focused in my mind on my one point, the center of ki, a point about 2 inches below my navel, held out my relaxed arm and imagined energy pouring through it as water through a fire hose and out through the tips of my fingers into the wall across the room, she could not make my arm bend at all. I was convinced, but there was yet another test. Our teacher, a very strong woman, positioned herself on one side of the room facing me in karate stance with her arm extended. Her arm was the barrier I had to get through, first trying strength and then extending ki. Making myself as strong as I could, I marched resolutely into her arm and nearly fell over backwards. It was like walking into the side of a barn. I then backed up, centered myself, and focused on the wall on the far side of the room. Thinking about how I wanted to reach that wall, feeling as if I had already reached it, and envisioning myself there, I relaxed into my power and walked straight through the barrier. This principle underlies the story of the old grandmother who, when her grandchild was pinned beneath the wheels of a car, dropped her cane and lifted the car off the child. There is something very important for the women's movement to be learned from this, but then, in 1982, I was not as clear about just what it was. My intuition was working overtime, but my brain wasn't getting the message. Even when the ERA failed, I was operating on 2 levels at the same time. For instance, for a speech I intended to give on the steps of the archives on the night of June 30th at the ritual morning ceremony, I wrote, "The men have taught us that we cannot win by working within their system, but that we must come at the problem from where we are, outside their power grid, outside their game. This, however, is our strength. We can have our own game out here, one in which they cannot see our cards, for a change, cannot control us or scare us or intimidate us." So far so good, but then, we have learned that we must confront and obstruct the system and make life so miserable and so impossible for those in power that they will be forced to negotiate with us and do it seriously. Why not 50,000 women refusing to pay taxes? Why not 1 million, 2 million? Why not every self-respecting woman in the nation? The founders of this country fought a revolution for being taxed without representation. If that should ever happen, we could be in the Constitution in 10 weeks instead of working within the system for 10 years and getting nowhere. Well, at least I was struggling towards something, even if I kept lapsing into the wrong-headed notion that confronting the system was working outside it, when in truth all reaction places us squarely in the center of its power. Ultimately, I would realize that civilly disobedient actions in all confrontation, though they may be exciting aerobic warm-up exercises, rousing the heart in preparation for the game, they are only that, warm-up exercises, and only for someone else. They are neither women's game nor appropriate or affordable warm-up exercises. But for this to become clear, I needed more experience, and I was on my way to getting it.